Okay, I'd like to welcome our Zoom webinar audience. I'm Jeff Mackler, the National Secretary of Socialist Action and Socialist Action's 2020 candidate for the US presidency against Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Our subject today is the struggle for immigration rights, and we have two well-informed speakers. From Minneapolis, Minnesota, a lifelong activist, bilingual immigration rights activist, Lisa Luinenberg, and from the Chicago area DuPage County Immigration Rights Committee, Cristobal Cavazos. Welcome, Cristobal. Welcome, Lisa.
Good evening.
Let me start with a front page headline in the Tuesday, September 15th New York Times. It says 400,000 immigrants can be forced to leave court rules. And it discusses a 2-to-1 decision of a court on the famous TPS. What's your take on that? Is it a real threat? Lisa, do you want to comment? And then we'll go to Cristobal.
Yeah, so this is actually a huge threat to immigrants and refugees in the United States. TPS stands for Temporary Protective Status, and it's a program that was put in place to protect immigrants from countries that have been affected by natural disasters, war, poverty, basically people who live in countries where it's not safe. Then they have a legal right to come to the United States and work here. And many of these people have been living here for decades. They have families, they own houses, they have jobs, they have children who are US citizens. And so this court decision is a huge threat because it basically means that it will remove this TPS protection from people from Haiti, Sudan, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. So basically they'll have to choose between being deported back to countries they haven't lived in for decades, many of which are still not safe places to live, or they stay here and lose their legal status.
Wow, Cristobal, what's your take on this? Is it a threat to the communities that you so often work with?
You know, it definitely is, Jeff, and Lisa is totally right. TPS is almost like a Band-Aid. If you take the case of El Salvador, where United States imperialism and the rest of Central America, I mean, there was really a hard hit in the 80s and the civil wars with the CIA, with the State Department interference, and people escaping for their lives, you know. And if you get the case of El Salvador with the Mara Salvatrucha violence, many of the Maras, the original ones, were from Los Angeles, many of them trained by the CIA, trained by the State Department in terrorist tactics to use against their own countrymen or to use in Nicaragua and El Salvador. This is super. We see the Salvadoran community, the Central American community here in Chicagoland mobilizing, and we need to fight like this. This has been a favorite scapegoat, you know, kicking them around every 3 years or so, you know, hey, we're going to let TPS die. We're going to let TPS die. We have a commitment to our brothers and sisters from Central America for what the United States has done to them here. And in the immigrant rights movement, it's of great import that we be solid in solidarity with this struggle, and that we call for a complete TPS rights, and to remove right away this verdict by executive decision or executive order, whatever. But this is of utmost importance, and we stand completely with our brothers and sisters in the TPS struggle.
I appreciate that. You know, I recall a young revolutionary who wrote his motorcycle diaries. Che Guevara was passing through Guatemala in the 50s at the time of the US-backed CIA coup that overthrew the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz. What followed was the installation of a dictatorship that, as you say, Cristobal, murdered 400,000 Guatemalans. And the Same thing happened with the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua, backed by the United States. It murdered at least 50, some say 80,000 Guatemalans. And of course, in El Salvador, the US death squad government did the same. So obviously, these refugees were forced to flee their country from a US imposed dictatorship. And now we have a situation where the perhaps most liberal federal district court in the country, the Ninth Circuit of the US Court of Appeals, rules that immigrants, hundreds of thousands, may be deported back to their country. Is this going to be appealed to the US Supreme Court? Does anybody realistically expect it to be reversed? And what brought this about? The Trump administration was in favor of this. Can you imagine mobilizations if they try to implement it? Where do we stand at this very moment? Is it people waiting? Are people waiting for appeals? Are they planning actions? What do you think can be done? What forces can be mobilized to challenge this reactionary decision of the most liberal federal district court in the country? Lisa, Cristobal, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, definitely. What you said, Jeff, is really important. It's really important for us to recognize that the United States has a very long history of military and economic intervention across Latin America. And not just Latin America, but Africa, Asia, all around the world. And this has really caused a stream of immigrants and refugees coming to the United States to flee the oppression and the economic poverty and just the horrible conditions that have been created in their countries. This is one of the big reasons that people are coming here, because their countries like El Salvador and Nicaragua and Mexico and many, many other countries have just been devastated by economic policies that are implemented by US and US imperialism. So that's a really important factor to recognize. I do think it's very likely that in this case, there will be appeals to the court against the TPS decision. This is something that the Trump administration has been pushing for a long time. But as we know, we can't rely on the courts to always protect the rights of immigrants and the most vulnerable people in our society. In the past, we've seen huge demonstrations of immigrants pouring out into the streets to defend their rights. Just millions of people, for example, back in 2006, when the really reactive Sensenbrenner legislation was being pushed through, we saw millions of people pour out in the streets, immigrants and their allies. So, and you know, many immigrants come from countries where they have a long history of labor organizing, unions, mass struggle, community collaboration, and this type of thing. So I think if this continues to be pushed forward, we're already seeing people protesting this in the streets, and we're only going to see more people out in the streets protesting against this policy.
I remember that bill supported by, was it Senator Sensenbrenner, which brought literally the largest protest to date in the history of the United States. Some 5 million people, including 1 million twice in Los Angeles alone, mobilized. And the mobilization was undertaken not only by the broad Latino community, but by the Catholic Church, because Sensenbrenner, as I recall, had a provision in it where any church that gave sanctuary to immigrants was subject to punishment, if not arrest and persecution, by the federal government. So they had to back off. But here you have a president who is supporting legislation to deport 100,000 people, and yet you have the Obama administration, Obama's nicknamed the Great Deporter, who actually deported 3 million immigrants. Why this focus on immigrants? Why this fear on immigrants? Why pick on immigrants today? What threat do they propose to the government? Or is it a fake threat? And the truth is they just want to keep them in a state of semi-bondage and fear of unionization, fear of organization, so they can continue to exploit among the most low-paid workers in the country. What's really happening here?
Yeah, I mean, Jeff, I mean, you hit it in large part. The state of Illinois, we were reading a study the other day that the state of Illinois, the population has actually been going down, and a lot of the Midwest too. The only growth in the working class that there's been is in the Latino community. The majority of the working class in a lot of Chicagoland, Joliet, Aurora, Elgin, are Latino workers. So the ruling class knows that there's no way they're going to deport everybody. So this is a favorite political ploy. It was coming out. I mean, if you drive around Chicagoland, there's warehouses everywhere. There's factories everywhere. A lot of these places are looking for workers, and a lot of these people are crying foul, saying, "Why aren't there people crossing from Mexico anymore? Where are my workers? Where are my workers?" The net immigration from Mexico has been pretty much zero for the past few years. So we don't have the workers that the growth of this economy. But as exactly like you said, the immigrants are the eternal scapegoat when the elections come. The immigrants are always the ones that are shut out. And it's almost a contradiction right now, as you say, that there was way more people deported when Obama was president, with all of his promises and with all of his sugared words, than here with the Trump administration. Going back to TPS a minute, the last time we were talking about TPS expiring, the Trump administration immediately sat down with Bukele, who's the president, the right-wing president of El Salvador, and essentially got Bukele to agree to a number of demands, including militarizing and essentially trapping Salvadorians in their own country. In the light of the caravans that were coming, in the light of the poverty that they were being hit with, in light of all of the struggles that the people have been facing, I am not exactly. I am pretty much sure, and I'm pretty much sure right now that the United States is looking for another pound of flesh from El Salvador, along with the other Central American nations, as the COVID crisis. We already start to see the rumblings of caravans coming up and leaving Central America with repressive governments, with lack of jobs, with lack of opportunities. It's even come out that global warming. We took Immigrant Solidarity Page, our group, took a trip to the border last year, and people were telling us, hey, the people from Honduras were saying, we're banana farmers, and with the climate right now, the rain cycle is so irregular that we can't even count on a banana harvest anymore. We don't know how it's going to come out. We don't know when it's going to come out. We don't know if it's going to come out. So these are big factors here. And I suspect here that, again, the calling for the cancellation of TPS, the United States is looking, particularly in Central America, for another pound of flesh of some of these Central American nations, particularly El Salvador, where a lot of the people come from.
Lisa, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just exactly what Cristobal said is really true. Like, a lot of people say, our immigration system is broken. It needs to be fixed. Our immigration system isn't broken at all. It was exactly designed to do what it's been doing. Like Cristobal was saying, immigrants are really the scapegoats of the working class. They're one of the most oppressed layers of the working class. They do the hardest jobs for the least amount of pay. They're working in factories, they're working in meatpacking plants, they're working out in the fields, and it's in the interest of the capitalist government and all the different agribusiness companies and multi-billion companies. They're profiting off of that labor of the immigrants. So it's in their best interest to keep them oppressed, to keep the wages low, and to promote this xenophobia and fear, in an effort to try to keep people from struggling or unionizing for their rights. And it also drives a wedge between different workers. when they promote these xenophobic ideas. It really drives barriers between different elements of the working class.
Yeah. You know, a couple of years ago, I took a campaign trip through southern Florida. And amazingly, I found that immigrant workers, among the lowest paid in the country, were confronted with a system with regard to the prison industrial complex where Fortune 500 agribusiness corporations were hiring prisoners in the increasingly privatized for-profit prisons, mostly Black, but Latino as well, at an average wage of 50 cents an hour, with Georgia and Mississippi paying nothing. Forced labor, if not slave labor, competing with immigrant labor, which at best is somewhere around the lowest rung minimum wage, or perhaps a bit more, if they are paid at all before vicious employers decide to organize a raid or foment a raid and deport them without being paid at all. So here you have the ruling rich counterposing prison labor to immigration labor, once again, to maximize profits in this cruel system. Have you heard of this phenomena?
Oh, big time, Jeff. I mean, there's a book called Immigrants for Sale. I mean, immigration for the oligarchs is money. An immigrant worker, you come here and you make money making great profits for the boss. You know, you make money here. I remember a few years ago in Chicago, there was a report that came out of all the money the police departments were arresting people without licenses, you know, and just setting them through the system. I mean, it was all a big charade, you know, it was all just a big game. And privatized prisons, yeah? And what you talk about with prison workers, I mean, this is all just money with money and money. Here in Chicagoland, our group, Immigrant Society page, has been battling a lot temp agencies. You know, in the old days, you would work directly for a company. You get hired by the capitalist. You have a direct relationship there. There's liability if you're hurt. There's liability, you know, for whatever. Negotiation, you negotiate with the capitalist. Now there's temp agencies here, which is essentially parasites that you go to this office and they send you out to a company and they pay you $12 and they pay the temp agency $25. When the worker is hurt, you know, they wash both the temp agency and the employer washes their hands of the worker. You know, he's not my worker, and that's pretty much the rule here in a lot of the warehouses in the area here in Chicagoland. In the Joliet area, we have the second greatest concentration of warehouses in all of the United States after New Jersey. The majority of these workers work for temp agencies, and it's no surprise that the ruling class is making ever more profits here, is ever more richer here, and the working class tends to be more undocumented, more poor, more brown, and more sick, you know, because you have no guarantees here. So what you say is dead on, and what you say also here is we're starting to see more and more worker struggles in these temp agencies, and worker struggles in the fields, and even prisoner struggles. You know, that really is going to be shaping the future here, because like I say, the immigrants are the perfect scapegoat. But I think in this election right now in general, you know, 8 years ago, you had Obama saying immigration reform within the first 100 days, immigration reform within the first 100 days. Now there's not even any guarantee at all. I mean, there's pretty anemic guarantees, but, you know, I think the immigrant worker understands, you know, we don't have a party there. The party is our struggle here. And in Chicago, there's been a lot of strike activity. In COVID, there has been a lot of walkouts here. So I think we're starting to see a little bit more of a militarization, a little bit more of a militant perspective and audacity in immigrant workers in this area, and from what I'm seeing in worker centers and immigrant groups around the country. So it's you know, in the great crisis here, it also gives us a great opportunity.
Cristobal, I appreciate that so much. Lisa, I've been reading about the spectacle of the warehouse workers that you've both referred to, standing elbow to elbow, maskless, in these meatpacking plants, even though they have been tested positive, going in with fever or taking Tylenol to reduce the fever so they can work even with the knowledge of the employers. And at the same time, I see full-page ads in the New York Times of some of the giant agribusiness and warehouse working employers explaining how they're friends and partners with their workers, how they're doing their best to maintain safe conditions. And yet the numbers, percentages of the people stricken with COVID-19 in these immigrant warehouses, and they're not just Latinos or poor Blacks, but they're people from Africa. They're people from all over the world who are brought here as the lowest labor force. Is this a reality still today in these meatpacking plants?
Yeah,
Or
absolutely,
even,
Jeff.
or even in these elderly care centers populated in significant numbers by immigrants, where the COVID-19 rate is incredible.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. Just what you said, immigrant workers, they're doing the lowest paid jobs in America. They're doing the essential work, frontline, in the midst of a pandemic. They're getting sick and they're very less likely to have health insurance than a lot of people who have more protections, job protections, or better paying jobs. So they're being disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And just what you said is true, Jeff. My own family came over as immigrants. My great-grandparents immigrated here from Holland. And my family worked in meatpacking plants for a long time. And my dad was also from a small town that has a large meatpacking industry. And just from the time when I was a child visiting there to today, that town has completely changed from a majority white population to a majority or very high immigrant population. And it's because people are going to the meatpacking plant that's there to find jobs. And it's a lot of Mexican immigrants or immigrants from Latin America, but there's also a really high number of African immigrants who work in that plant. You can tell just by driving through the town with all the little, different restaurants from different areas of the world that are sprinkled around the town now. It's completely changed the character. And this is true in many parts of America, that, these are the only jobs that a lot of immigrants and refugees are able to get. And these are sometimes people who were doctors or teachers or, university professors in their own countries. They come here to the United States and they can't get those types of jobs, and they end up working in meatpacking plants or factories or out in the fields under the worst conditions. And then I think we also have to remember that, the whole system of deporting people and detaining people has really also been driven by that bottom line of profit. There's now been a $1 billion system that's grown up around for-profit detention centers, and that's where a lot of these immigrants are being held. Before they're deported, they can be held there for months, and those have also been just hotspots for spreading COVID virus.
What is the situation today regarding the separation of children from their parents? Is that still ongoing? These stories about parents can't literally find their children, and I'm talking about youngsters, 1, 2, 3, 4 years old. Is that an ongoing issue today?
That is certainly one of the diabolic policies that we've ever seen, the zero tolerance by field in place by Stephen Miller, who was pretty much an open fascist. designed to keep the people away by just punishing them and making them suffer. And there's really no end when you have a scorched earth policy like that, make the people suffer as much as you can. And that the United States was exposed before the whole world for violations of human rights. I mean, the Nuremberg trials would make people blush if they saw this, separation of family, kids in cages. We formed a powerful movement against this. We marches and rallies and boycotts and whatever we could do to call out the Trump administration's fascistic policy on immigration. This has been, for the most part, alleviated. As far as the new cases, from what we understand. I mean, who's to know what's going on? But there's still a lot of kids that have been, that are without their parents. There's still a lot of separated families. There was a case here in Chicagoland of an orphanage that was just full of kids, and who are these kids, Where are their parents? It's a huge human rights crisis. It's still going on today. I don't know how much to believe from the Border Patrol, but there was a big fight to overturn that family separation policy. And we gave the government a big whooping as far as the movement is concerned. So I've understood the official line is that there's no longer family separations as a policy, but we still have all the separated people here. I think this shows the capitalist system's disregard, the disrespect, the racism inherent in the system, the class hatred of people from the Southern Cone that are brown and poor. You talked earlier, Jeff, about nursing homes. Here we had a major crisis in nursing homes because in Illinois, there's a big elderly population. We had a call in April from a woman who told us that there was 30 people that were sick in her nursing home. This is a nursing home close to here. 30 people, elderly people with COVID. She has no health insurance. When she found out that, that everyone was sick, that she washed people. Her job was washing people, taking a bucket and washing them. When she found out there was 30 people that were with COVID, she decided that she didn't want to go to work that day because she lived with her elderly mother-in-law. And she knew, I'm going to get her sick and she's going to die. When she called in sick to work, her supervisor picked up the phone and said, if you don't show up to work today, we're going to make a little call to immigration. So essentially, as a form of new school slavery here, you work for me or you're going to be deported. So we really see the strange irony in modern capitalism, United States, a late phase capitalism here, of the immigrant that's so important to the maintenance of the system, but at the same time so gutted of their rights. And you see that in Aviva Chomsky's Illegal People, how you have this new category of people. You had the slave in the old day, you had the chattel slavery, you had the sharecropper, but now you have the undocumented immigrant here that essentially has got all the weight of the economy, none of the rights. And this is where the struggle comes in.
Incredibly horrific. So sorry. Let me shift gears. But first, to remind our listeners that you're listening to a Socialist Action Zoom webinar with Cristobal Cavazos and Lisa Luinenberg. Lisa is from the Twin Cities, long-term immigration activist, and Cristobal is from the DuPage area outside of Chicago, both activists in immigration rights and organizing and committees. When I came to California, there was such a thing as the yellow pages in the newspaper. You remember the yellow pages where you could look and find the address of different businesses? The yellow pages had page after page after page of trade unions who organized working people in the construction trades, the building and construction trades, including the painters union. Today, you can barely find them. All of those jobs, the overwhelming number of those once union jobs paying $25, $30, $40 an hour and more, plus pensions, plus benefits, have disappeared. because the unions have allowed the employers to bring in immigrant workers paid at virtual minimum wages to replace the trade unions. And when we went to these trade unions and said, "They're crying out loud, don't you understand that the organization of the poorest of the poor is the way to build your union, to unionize the entire working class, to set the example?" But instead, most of them began with the premise that, well, we have seniority, we're privileged, we don't want Latinos taking our jobs. And the result was the common doom of the union movement and the immigrant rights conditions of workers in San Francisco. And that situation has been repeated everywhere in the United States. Is there any sign of life? Is there any stirrings in the trade union movement? Is there any understanding that an injury to one is an injury to all? That organizing immigrant workers is to the advantage of everyone? That the boss can always say, "White boy, you don't take a wage cut, we'll get an immigrant to work for half." So the very discrepancy between union and non-union workers automatically pushes downward everyone's wages. What's your experience? What can you tell us about efforts at unionization or even organization of the immigrants to fight back? What does the future hold?
Lisa, you could start if you like.
Sure. Well, that's a really important question, Jeff. And the truth is that immigrants have been part of union movements for a very, very long time, and they will continue to be in the future. Many people, especially in Latin America, really come from countries that have a long history of trade union organization and very radical trade union organization, in fact. And so they know a lot of these tactics. And we've seen a history of immigrants participating in trade union movements. Like just coming to my mind here in Minneapolis, we like to talk about the 1934 Teamster strikes. Well, one of the leaders of that strike was, he was an undocumented immigrant. He was driven out of Sweden. He was put on the blacklist for his union organizing over there. And he was one of the leaders of the strike. And they also organized with the unemployed, they organized with women, and they organized with Native Americans as well. So that's the kind of solidarity that we need to see in the union movement today. And like I mentioned before, you know, a lot of this rhetoric and the racism and just the xenophobia and that kind of stuff that we hear in the media or in the elections all the time about, you know, immigrants are taking our jobs or, you know, that kind of thing. It's the purpose of that is to drive a wedge between the working class. It's to drive apart those two parts when really, you know, the white workers and the brown workers and black workers, we have so much more in common with each other than we do with the ruling class. But those kinds of things are really meant to drive apart and break up the union and keep people from organizing in solidarity when really that's what we need to push the movement forward.
I wanted to add to that. We have to remember that the closest thing we've had to a general strike in years was in 2006. And who are these workers out there? These were, as you mentioned, Jeff, 1 million workers in Los Angeles. In Chicago, we had about 500,000 people in the streets. New York, Miami, Houston. I mean, this was the closest thing to a general strike. And in the process, reviving May Day, reviving in a lot of cases, unions like AFL-CIO starting to wake up. Hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? You know, we've missed a huge, huge potential here for unionization. I think we found the unions, they've been too comfortable. They've been too comfortable in the wave coming from the 50s and the 60s. Here in Illinois, the majority of the unions, they're happy just finding some government workers, you know, find 100 government workers somewhere, here we go, we're fine. they haven't done the hard work, the majority of them anyway, they haven't done the hard work that it takes to go into these warehouses, to go into these factories, because this is going to be work. I mean, this is going back to the 30s. Oftentimes you're in industrial parks in the middle of nowhere, or in meat packing plants in the middle of Iowa. This is really going to take a commitment here. We have a worker center, the Casa DuPage Worker Center, where we really see the immigrant worker having the potential to raise the whole floor. We have taken on a lot of companies. We've taken on a lot of unions. I mean, a lot of times it's the company union that's really holding the workers back. But we really see the potential of just the sheer number of immigrant working class, undocumented immigrant working class. And one of the few rights that you have in the working class is to form a union. So we really have been taking this forward as much as we can in the strike, trying to get the strikes happening, trying to get union drives happening, forming workers' associations. So I think that we're just starting a new chapter here in the labor movement here that traces its origin from the 2006 general strike that we saw after James Sessenbrenner passed the HR 4437 bill, essentially calling for the mass deportation of everyone. So I think that's just a little bit of a flick that we can see, a little bit of a shimmer of what we can see of what immigrants could actually do with the right leadership and with the right unity and ideology.
Thanks so much, Cristobal and Lisa. You are listening to two first-rate, lifelong political activists who are fighting for immigrant rights, and in the course of that, they of course fight for everyone's rights. This webinar is one of a series of Thursday, 5 p.m. California time, 7 p.m. in the Midwest time, brought to you by Socialist Action. You can contact us at socialistaction.org or email us if you're interested in joining a revolutionary socialist party. Contact us at socialistaction@lmi.net. Let me turn the discussion a bit. Here we saw, in the middle of the worst pandemic in the last 100 years, literally between 15 and 26 million people mobilizing in the streets in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, who were protesting systemic racism in the United States. I've been around for a long time as an old timer, but I'll tell you, it brought tears to my eyes when I saw young, largely white working class youth joining their Black sisters and brothers in the streets saying no to systemic racism. I think that we're not far away from seeing that unity include immigrants, Native Americans, all oppressed people. They seem to be increasingly aware that it's not just COVID-19. It's not just systemic racism against Blacks and Latinos. It's not just defense of immigrant rights. It's not just climate crisis oblivion. It's not just an economy that is coming apart. It's not just endless wars against poor people around the world, whether they be in Latin America, Venezuela, attempted coups. It's a whole system of capitalism that has no solutions to the key problems. One of the things that people are talking about is Trump's recent stand back, stand by statement to the reactionary, neo-fascist, racist Proud Boys. These type of organizations, while in my opinion minuscule, have been encouraged to attack immigrants, to attack people of color, to attack trade unionists and left-wing progressive activists. What's your take on the significance of these right-wing groups today? Are they a serious threat, or is the real threat the government of the United States and its policies? Who shall I call on? Lisa, Cristobal?
Lisa, you could go ahead.
All right. That's a great question, Jeff. Yeah, a lot of people were really horrified when Trump came out with that statement during the debate. and the reaction that I got from the Proud Boys. I think that we have seen in the last decade or so really a rise of these kind of right-wing, xenophobic, fascist type hate groups. They've really been on the rise. This is something that we've dealt with a long time in the immigrant community. Something that I remember, a decade ago, organizing an event and a bunch of fascists showed up and tried to disrupt what we were doing. So that's something that we've dealt with for a long time, and we know it's a threat. But I think recently we've seen a rise of these types of groups, not just in the United States, but also in other countries. The United States is not the only country that's facing a crisis with its immigration system right now. There are a lot of countries in Europe and other more developed parts of the world that are facing a huge influx of immigrants from the Middle East and Africa, countries that have been ravaged by war and poverty. We've seen like Golden Dawn in Greece and other types of these groups in Europe that are also on the rise. So I think that, we're not at the level where we have a widespread fascist threat in the United States right now, but it's something that we have to take seriously, because one thing that the Trump administration has done is I think it's encouraged these groups to become more outspoken and bolder. And I think there is a real fear in the immigrant community, especially since Trump was elected. People are genuinely afraid, and we know that hate crimes are on the rise. So this is something that we have to take seriously. But like you said, we know that the real threat comes from the US government. It doesn't matter who gets elected. They're going to put forward the policies of the ruling class. And those policies have always oppressed, the most vulnerable layers of our society, like immigrants and refugees, women, LGBTQ people, Black people, Native Americans, everyone.
Cristobal, what's your take on the right-wing groups that appear to be mobilizing in tiny numbers? Are they a serious threat? Are they the central threat? Are people looking to them as the enemy, or I should say as the central problem, or are they looking at the broader policies of the government? Let me, for example, jump ahead to our last question. Here we have the spectacle of Joe Biden looking for the Latinx vote, being the vice president of Barack Obama, who deported more people than any president in the history of the United States, 3 million. And yet he believes that he can get the Latino vote automatically because he's a lesser evil than Trump. He's the initiator, along with Obama and Clinton before him, of the whole series of laws that led to the filling of our prisons to unprecedented numbers. The United States has the largest number and percentage of people in prisons than any nation on earth, the majority Black, Latino, and Native American. Where do we stand? Is there a consciousness on the part of the immigrant community that there's something fundamentally wrong with both parties? Are they going to jump headlong to the Democrats? Are there those who are interested in revolutionary socialist ideas, like Socialist Action, which is campaigning across the country, not only for immigrant rights, but for the building of a massive movement to challenge capitalist prerogatives on every front? Cristobal?
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen a Trump administration that sought to fan the flames of these fringe groups. I mean, they're really fringe groups. I mean, they're on the fringe, they're wing nuts, whatever you want to call them. I think one of the real realities that we're seeing why there have these groups like Proud Boys have seen an audience, or some of these right-wing organizations, is we've seen over the past year a two-party collusion in hollowing out essentially what we got in the 30s, what the New Deal policies, the wages that we've earned, the guarantees at work. We're essentially all facing right now what you can call a gig economy. That essentially you have no union, you have no guarantee at work, and if you're working class, you have even less. So you could see the some of the appeal for some of these fringe groups here on the right, but at the same time, you have two parties that neither of them is speaking to the reality of the working class. Who is talking about a class struggle? The Democrats haven't talked about class in years. I think since the early 70s, the late 60s, they've chosen to put their efforts into culture wars and identity politics at the expense of the ruling class. And the Republicans, you see, they don't even have a pretense at even talking about the ruling class at all. They put in this patriotism and this phony, this chauvinism and religious fervor and whatnot. I see an opening right now, going particularly with the immigrant community. It's more clear than ever that the Latino community doesn't have a candidate, that they have no stakes in the game of this election. Obama, he was given, after the mega marches that we had and after the Bush presidency, he was coming in promising, making tons of promises here in a very charming way, in a very articulate way. I think he got about over 70% of the Latino vote. Immediately, the deportations, there was a complete sense of betrayal there. The victories that we did have in that time were victories not of the Democratic Party, but the social movement, victories on the streets, victories in the marches and the protests here. So I think it's ever more clear with Joseph Biden and with Donald Trump that we really have no skin in this game as far as Latinos are concerned. With Trump, we have no expectations and no illusions. And I think with Joseph Biden, that's pretty much the same thing. I don't think it's credible that he's, what do you say? We're going to do an immigration reform this time, guys. We're going to do it. We're going to make it happen this time, guys. Just trust in me. I don't think that's credible anymore. But what I am seeing right now as well is as I've been seeing for a few years, there's a great, in Illinois, for example, the majority of people support immigrant rights. In Illinois, for example, the majority of people want higher taxes on the rich. In Illinois, for example, the majority of the people, they support Black Lives Matter. So we have this wide unity on a lot of progressive issues here, but we don't have political parties that are speaking to this reality here. We don't have a credible alternative right now. And this is a big problem. And I think going into this election here, that's ever so clear. Last week in the debates, watching two old, rich white men, servants of the ruling class, servants of the oligarchy, servants of Wall Street here, going at it, as if they had this huge spat when they're essentially in agreement on foreign policy, in agreement on oligarchy, in agreement on the Wall Street here. Everything else, what they're arguing about is secondary here. You stop and say, wait a minute here. Is this really our choices in this big gamut here? And I think it's the time for the left. I think it's the time for the socialist movement. It's really our time to advance here because, as I say, there's broad support for our ideas among so-called Republicans and so-called Democrats here. We just need to have that audacity. We need to have that unity, and the working class needs to see that we're out there struggling with them.
Thank you, Cristobal. Let me ask you a final question, both of you. The media constantly refers to essential workers. We need these essential workers to keep the economy going. That is, the food service workers, the waiters, the busboys, the hospital workers, the orderlies, the meatpacking workers. These so-called essential workers are the lowest paid. These essential workers do keep the economy going, and yet a huge percentage of them, according to the government's Department of Labor, can't be expected to get their jobs back at all. You're right. So many work in the low-page, part-time, low-wage gig economy from job to job with very few benefits. Seems to me that the central problem is an economy where literally, and I say this literally, some half dozen to a dozen multi-billionaires in the United States earn as much of the new wealth created every year as 50% of the entire population. Half of 340 million people, their income is exceeded by a dozen multi-billionaires. And it's getting worse and worse and worse. What should we expect from the immigrant rights movement leadership? Are there new young people coming forward to speak as you do? Are there prospects for massive mobilization in the face of this pandemic that has taken the lives of 210 million people and infected close to 8 million, the largest number and percentage in the so-called advanced capitalist world? Where do we go from here? Let's make that the final question. I'll take a 1-minute summary and we'll call it a night. Who'd like to start? Cristobal? Lisa?
Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, Jeff, that's really true what you said. You know, I think the people that are the so-called essential workers are often the people that come from the most oppressed layers of our society. And they're the ones that are being most profoundly affected by the pandemic right now. I think, you know, one effect that this pandemic has had and the crisis that our country is going through right now around police brutality and racism is, you know, that it's raising the consciousness of a whole new generation and a whole new layer of young people. And like you said, Jeff, before, you know, when we saw these mass protests after George Floyd was so brutally murdered by the police, not just George, but so many other people as well, you know, we really saw a lot of young people coming out in the streets. And for me, that's the hope that, you know, these young people that are being so profoundly affected right now by the pandemic, who are losing their jobs, who don't have health insurance, that they're learning and they're understanding about what's happening in our country and our economy right now. And, you know, they'll continue to go out in the streets and organize. I mean, the fact that we saw millions of people going out into the streets in the middle of the largest pandemic that we've seen in 100 years is just incredible. So I think we'll see that continue, hopefully, in the future.
Thanks. Cristobal, you have the last word.
You know, the immigrant rights movement has been responsible for the sanctuary movement, the local coalitions coming together in the spirit of struggle, in the spirit of socialism, in the spirit of human rights here across the country. It's been the immigrant rights movement that have forced cities to put in place sanctuary city ordinances. You see places like Seattle that also, you know, a sanctuary city going $15 an hour. I think that the sanctuary movement, the immigrant rights movement, tracing all the way back to 2006, I think there's a great possibility here. And I think there's a lot of things happening on the ground. I mean, we don't hear it from the political parties, but movements in Chicago, in New York, in Los Angeles here have done all kinds of incredible things, you know, for workers' rights, for immigrant rights, healthcare programs for undocumented individuals, programs, the driver's license for individuals who are undocumented. In Illinois, for example, alone, there's places where counties have their own cards, their own identification cards. It doesn't matter if you have status or not. These are stuff that can be won by the movement. And I think it's ever more clear that the spirit of these struggles and the sanctuary struggle for everyone in this area is equal. Everyone in this area has the same rights, the same dignity, the same decency here, is informed by socialist ideas. And if you could see the anger and the wrath that Donald Trump speaks of sanctuary cities, you could see the right wing, the sanctuary city movement has been one of the favorite enemies, their favorite boogeyman, even among a lot of Democrats. I mean, the sanctuary cities are something to be, to push away. But I think the movement that's inspired the sanctuary cities is going to be branching out. I think that's going to be branching out into factories. It's going to be branching out into the workplace. It's going to be branching out into healthcare. So these coalitions, Immigrant Society page right now, we're working on a lot of different fronts. The worker struggle, the health struggle, the struggle against landlords right now, trying to evict people here. But a lot of these socialist ideas are being fought tooth and nail right now by immigrant rights groups. And a lot of, we saw the Bernie Sanders campaign that put it out, but you saw a lot of the Latino community that was attracted to that campaign, in spite of the limited socialist ideas of Bernie Sanders, but they still saw something there. The Medicare for all, the raising the minimum wage, really, a lot of sectors saw Bernie as the champion of the working class. And I really was his socialism, or his claiming to be a representative of socialism, what attracted the Latino community. So I think we have a lot of possibility here. I'm hopeful for the future. As far as the struggle at the local level, immigrant coalitions are concerned, I'm not hopeful about this next election. As you said, Jeff, when Obama was elected, whoever wins this election, but Biden or Trump, I don't wish them well. But I do wish the movement well, and I do wish the immigrant rights movement well, the Black Lives Matter movement well, the feminist movement well. I think there's a lot of important things happening on the streets right now, and we need to, as socialists, have this overarching framework of having a party that's going to be a working class party here that puts us all together under a big tent here, but a tent for the working class and not for the oligarchs.
Thank you, Cristobal, Cavazos, and thank you, Lisa Luinenberg. A couple of announcements. Join us next week, same time, 5 o'clock California time, 7 o'clock Midwest, 8 o'clock in New York, for an incredible webinar with Gail Walker. Gail Walker is the co-national chair of the National Network on Cuba. She is the daughter of Lucius Walker, the former, now deceased, leader, founder of IFCO Pastors for Peace, and Ike Nahum, a lifelong Cuba solidarity activist on defense of the Cuban Revolution as it faces imperialist attack. Contact us at socialistaction.org, our website, or socialistaction@lmi.net. We want you to join us. We are a revolutionary party, which is simply defined as a party who believes that the inherent evils that so many of us agree on, racism, poverty, gig economy, endless wars, immigration, prejudice, sexism, Black Lives Matter, environmental destruction are not accidents that can be remedied by the candidates of big capital, but require a challenge to the system. In order to do that, we need to build a mass, united, revolutionary party with activists deeply rooted in every struggle for humankind. Join Socialist Action. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week with Gail Walker and Ike Nahum talking about a revolution that we consider exemplary. Thank you again, Lisa and Cristobal. And with that, we'll call it a night exactly at the top of the hour.
Good night, my dear brother. Buenas noches.